Today's video was made possible by my patrons. Not only do they get cool exclusive stuff, they make it possible for me to make content like this and do it independently. If you want to sign up and buy me a coffee to support the channel, or help me out in case this video gets me sued into oblivion, you could do that with the link down in the description. Okay, this is gonna be a weird video. A little while ago, I was out mowing the lawn, and a question came to mind that has been absolutely breaking my brain. If you went on Splice and you downloaded all the basics, let's say a drum loop, a bass loop, a chord loop, and a vocal loop, and you put that together and you release it, that's your song, right? I mean, it makes sense, you made it. But if your friend goes on Splice, uses those same loops, and puts together a song and releases that song, who owns the song? At this point, I actually don't know anymore. And after pretty exhaustively researching this for the last couple weeks, I'm walking away from all this significantly more frustrated and confused than I was going into it. Before I open my big stupid mouth and say anything else in this video, I think it's important to establish a few key things right up front here, because people tend to only watch the first 14 seconds of a video before freaking out and screeching in the comments. First off, this is not a hot tea takedown video on Splice or anything like that. I love services like Splice and Loop Cloud and all that stuff, and I think this idea of samples as a subscription is one of the best innovations in music in the last decade. When I was getting started in music, samples only came in sample packs, and I couldn't afford to go out spending $150 a week on sample packs to only use a few kick drums from them. Secondly, the reason I'm using Splice as the key example in this video is because it's probably the most popular sample subscription service, and also the most notorious for causing copyright issues. But I think the reason for that is really just basic math and logic. The more people that use the service, the more people that use the same samples, and the more people that end up stuck in copyright hell. Thirdly, I am a professional musician, I'm a professional sound designer, and I'm a pretty amateur YouTuber. And as a musician, and especially as a YouTuber, like a lot of you, I have had my fair share of getting mushroom stamped by Content ID. And that's what I want to talk about in this video, because I think we have a really big problem, and I'm not actually sure there's a way to solve it. This video is not going to be able to provide an answer to any of this, and that's not my intention here. This is also not meant to be some kind of boomer rant on sampling culture in music. I just have a question that I can't seem to get an answer to. I spent quite a bit of time calling various music lawyers, copyright lawyers, and entertainment lawyers here in Nashville, and not one of them could give me a clear-cut answer on any of this. So I wanted to make this video to open up a discussion about all this and see what everyone else thinks, because I don't have an answer, and frankly, I don't know what to make of any of this at this point. First, we need to lay down some basic musical legal context for all of this. Sampling is pretty simple, but it's also pretty complicated. Sampling is fairly straightforward, and there are rights and royalties involved, and it's important to understand what these two things mean. The most basic example of all this is if I wrote a song and then you copied that song and you released that song, you're now infringing on my rights to that musical work as part of my intellectual property. However, if I wrote a song and you really liked the melody and you want to use the melody for that in your song, you can sample it. Then you would contact me or the publishing company or the rights holder, ask for a fee or a royalty split, come to some kind of agreement, and then you can use that melody in your song and release it. The next example would be a sample pack. If I make a sample pack, once you buy the sample pack, you're allowed to use those one-shots and loops in your songs. However, it's important to understand that you do not own those sounds. You own a license to use them in your music. These are what we would call royalty-free sound, and this is the cornerstone of all these sample subscription services and basically every sample pack ever made. These are sounds that you're allowed to use in your music without needing to pay an additional royalty to the owner of these sounds, in this case, me, the person who made the sample pack. However, if you go out and try to sell the one-shots and loops as your own sample pack, you're now infringing on the rights of the owner of the sounds. Then we get into the weirder case of what I would call the public sample pool. These are samples that are so common and so iconic ironic that enforcing any kind of royalty collection on any of these would just be impossible. Things like the Amen break, samples from popular memes, the chop snare, or the Fairlight Orchestra hit have become so deeply ingrained into music culture that there's no reasonable way to enforce or collect royalties or establish rights to the use of these samples. So in a weird way, they sort of become public domain. Without sampling, music would be a very different place today. Sampling allows artists to create new, interesting takes on a work and enables artists who aren't really traditional musicians to create music by sampling and reconstructing different ideas and elements to create a new, original work. Sampling is obviously a very important part of what music is today, and with services like Splice offering artists convenient access to millions and millions of royalty-free samples, it's more popular and arguably more important than ever. It would probably be harder to find a song produced today that doesn't use samples to some extent than a song that does. But after a certain point, who owns the sample? Flipping back into legal mode here, we need to talk about how the idea of ownership is determined in music. I'm sure you've all seen those videos of songs that sound like other songs, or read the articles about court cases where big bands have gone to court over songs they wrote and some smaller band claims that they wrote it 20 years ago and all that kind of stuff. But this is where things get really subjective and really complicated and really messy really quick. So for the sake of time, my own sanity, and me not being a music lawyer, we're just gonna skim over the key points you need to understand here. There are certain aspects of a song that can't be copyrighted. This would be things like chords, rhythm, time signatures, tempo, or fragments of lyrics. These just can't be considered intellectual property within reason. If that was the case, we would have run out of music a really long time ago. However, some aspects of a song can be considered intellectual property and protected by copyright. These would be things like a melody, or the lyrics, or other distinctive elements that make a song unique and identifiable. In cases where any of this falls into question or it's disputed, there are two key factors to prove: access and substantial similarity. Unfortunately, like other legal stuff, this once again gets really complicated really quick and really just comes down to argument rather than cut and dry facts. In short, access means that the defendant heard or could be presumed to have heard the plaintiff's song before infringing on the song. Substantial similarity, on the other hand, is basically whether or not the average listener could tell that one song is the same as another. This is where things get complicated. In court cases, this all really falls down to argument. This comes down to the testimony of music experts and music analysts and relies on proving it to a jury who probably can't understand much of it, let alone read music or analyze a piece of music effectively, and then it all falls back to lawyers raking in fat stacks while they sit there and argue. So this now brings us back to the splice problem. If you sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and the alphabet back to back, you'll notice something interesting. They're the same melody. There's a little bit of a rhythmic difference, but for the sake of argument, they're 99% the same. So now we go to Splice. If you download one melody loop and someone else goes and downloads that same melody loop, who owns that melody? Now on Splice, if you go in and download a melody and use it in your track, and someone else downloads that same melody and uses it in their track, because it's royalty-free samples, all should be well, assuming all other things are equal, right? Well, in the case of Daddy Content ID, that is definitely not the case. One of my favorite artists, J-Views, has probably one of the most popular packs on Splice. His Organic Electronics series has received somewhere over 2.5 million downloads, meaning that a lot of damn people have used these same loops and samples. While using a single kick drum sample is really unlikely to get you into legal hot water, using a melody sample can be a very different story, especially when that same sample gets used by an artist who finds massive success with their track. In J-Views' Organic Electronics pack, there's a sample humbly named Tonal Loop Space Melancholy Guitar B minor 150 .wave. This sample was eventually used in a track by Lil Baby and Gunna called Drip Too Hard, which now has over 1 billion plays on Spotify. The original loop was at 150 beats per minute and in the key of B minor. In Drip Too Hard, though, the sample was used at 225 beats per minute and transposed down 5 semitones to make it in the key of F sharp minor. Although this is a more classic case of sampling where the original sample is manipulated slightly, a lot of artists don't go through even these 2 basic steps to change a sample and simply use it as it is. Before we all get out our pitchforks and break into the boomer weeds of arguing about lazy music and lazy sampling and the ethics therein, it's important to remember that this is what services like Splice are built on. It's the idea that it's totally okay to go in and use any of these samples as is in your music, except that it's totally not. If we go back to what we know about copyright in music, melody and substantial similarity are 2 of the key factors that determine who owns a song. But if 2 people use the same melody loop, who owns it? Although it is exceedingly unlikely that 2 artists are going to release identical tracks using samples from a service like Splice or a similar service, and it's even more unlikely that these 2 artists are then going to get embroiled in a long and expensive legal battle over the fractions of a penny that Daddy Daniel Ek decided to pay them for their artistic toils and labor. The problem emerges when systems like Content ID or other algorithmic or automatic processes are used to determine an arbitrary owner of these things. Robots can't determine context. Robots can't determine if a royalty-free loop was used, and I highly doubt that the manual review team on most platforms understands or even remotely cares about any of this because it is a legal minefield. Although you are able to submit a dispute if you find yourself in a case like this where you get a claim when using a royalty-free loop, the onus of all this falls on the person receiving the dispute most of the time. And if they choose to not reply and simply ignore it, what are you gonna do about it? By now, YouTube has made it plenty clear that they simply just don't give a shit about fixing Content ID. And after looking into this myself, to play devil's advocate, I can't say that I blame them, because there's so much complex subjectivity and context at play here that I don't think it's possible for Content ID to be fixed. On the other hand, countless musicians and music experts have testified to the government about things like fair use, the DMCA, and just the general outdated hellscape that is copyright law, at least here in the US. But unfortunately, the living corpses that make and enforce these rules probably are just never going to understand this stuff. It would be like me trying to teach my grandpa, who's never even used a smartphone, how to use a melody loop in Ableton and then explain to him why I can take that same thing and use it in my song. So what can we do about all of this? And that brings me back to the question that's been driving me insane. At this point, I'm tapping out because I don't f***ing know what to think about any of this, and I can't think of any kind of solution. I think it's important that we do figure out some kind of solution because this is a pretty big problem, but even the most straightforward solutions would require Splice and every other sample service to register every sound in their database with Content ID and every other automatic content recognition system, and that is just unreasonable to do. I'm leaving this video and this topic way more confused and frustrated than I was coming into it. I had some confidence early on that I was going to be able to have some kind of point or takeaway with all this, but that got nipped in the bud real quick. But I would love to get your thoughts on all of this. What do you think that we can do? Who really owns a sample anymore? Is ownership of a sample determined by success? And at what point does a sample fall into that public sampling pool? I don't know, and I'm gonna stop thinking about this now before I have an aneurysm. So that's it. I wish I could end this on a high note or something, but this is kind of anticlimactic, I guess, in a way. But hopefully this opens up an interesting discussion down in the comments, and I hope that you enjoyed this little thought experiment as well. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, maybe, and I guess I hope this inspires you to get out there and make something awesome.